Alex Pearson, a 42-year-old businessman from Boston, Massachusetts, disappeared on the evening of December 7, 2023, but no one found out until the next morning. All the security cameras at his luxurious home in Weston, a cozy suburb with wide streets and high fences, suddenly stopped recording that evening. His wife, Susan Pearson, attributed it to a broken system. Allegedly, Alex had long promised to take care of the repairs but never found the time. But that was just the beginning. The next morning, Susan showed up at the police station, eyes swollen with tears and her voice shaking. She claimed her husband hadn't come home from a meeting with friends and asked the police officers to check every possible place he could have been. Her desperation seemed so genuine that no one even thought to doubt her words. The officers assured her that everything would be fine. Alex had probably just gone for a walk or stayed overnight at someone's house. However, things weren't so simple. At the missing person's location, Alex's car was in the garage, his office keys were on the hallway table, and even his wallet and phone were left on the kitchen table. Only one thing was conspicuous. There was a small, barely visible bloodstain in the sink, which Susan described as an accidental cut from cooking. That same day, detectives began searching for signs of Alex all over Boston, combing parks and reviewing surveillance footage of downtown. But no passers-by had seen the man in the dark coat he usually left the house with on chilly winter evenings. No one saw him in parking lots, in cafes, or on the street. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, Susan seemed exhausted and broken by grief. She stayed on the phone, waiting to hear from her husband. When Alex's friends began calling her, she cried into the receiver each time, telling of her anxiety and hopelessness. And yet, something in her reaction kept Detective Lewis, who took the case, on his toes. He was a veteran of the Boston department and, in 20 years of service, had seen many cases where first impressions proved deceptive. The first suspicions arose a week later when Detective Lewis found a camera tape from the street leading to the Pearson house. On the day of the disappearance, a black car had driven into the neighborhood, parked near the house, and someone got out with a large package wrapped in black plastic. The cameras did not capture the driver's face, but Susan was home alone at the time, which was confirmed by neighbors. From that moment on, the police began to closely monitor her actions. Amid all this, in the house, Susan was too calm. She said she was trying to hold on for the sake of their daughter, Lily, but she didn't seem like the kind of woman who wouldn't let fear show. It seemed her tears were meant for the public, and there was some secret lurking beneath them. When the police obtained a search warrant for the house, they found something strange in the garage, traces of a recently flushed liquid and a faint chemical odor. There was an inconspicuous splatter mark on the wall, as if someone had tried to thoroughly clean it up but had failed completely. The police collected samples and sent them off for examination, but even before they got the results, Lewis already knew something was wrong, and Susan was obviously hiding something serious. And while they were collecting evidence, Susan continued to press for pity, skillfully playing the role of the victim. She gave interviews to the local news, begging viewers to help find her husband, telling them what a wonderful man Alex was. She hugged Lily, holding her in front of the cameras, crying and begging for her daddy to come home. But in reality, she cared about other things. A few days after Alex's disappearance, Susan unexpectedly went to a lawyer about her husband's inheritance and said she needed to protect the family's financial health. Police officers who accessed her phone records found that she had made numerous calls to an unknown number in recent months, and each time, those conversations lasted more than an hour. All the while, no one could find an answer to the ultimate question: where had Alex Pearson gone? At first, the police tried not to jump to conclusions. After all, men in crisis sometimes leave without warning, and the prospect of family breakdown can prompt impulsive action. But Detective Lewis couldn't ignore the strange details. Susan Pearson continued to act as if she was trying to draw public attention to her grief, but none of her stories provided a clear answer to the question: what had happened to Alex that night? Detectives were soon bombarded with forensic results. Samples from the garage floor showed the presence of chemical compounds commonly used to dissolve biological traces. Under ultraviolet light, traces of what looked like blood spatter showed up, which they had tried in vain to wash away. Experts confirmed that the chemical composition of the residue matched industrial cleaners used to remove blood traces, all of which pointed to a possible violent incident in the Pearson garage. But evidence is not proof. Lewis knew such details would look like circumstantial evidence in court, and so he delved deeper into Susan's life. Her phone records kept showing strange calls, long conversations with an anonymous interlocutor, mostly in the late evenings. Every time detectives tried to trace the number, it went back to a virtual service in another state, making the task more difficult. Who was this mysterious interlocutor? Why was Susan hiding their communication? And what could it have to do with her husband's disappearance? Meanwhile, the search for Alex Pearson continued. Susan hired a private investigator, saying she wanted to speed up the search process. In public, it looked like a sincere desire to find her husband, but Detective Lewis saw other motives. Private investigators often work without the constraints that bind the police, which means their involvement could have been an attempt to divert attention from something important. Lewis began to check the work of the hired detective, suspecting that Susan might even have been trying to confuse the investigation in this way. About a week and a half later, the first real breakthrough appeared in the case. A distant neighbor remembered seeing a black van outside the Pearson house the night Alex disappeared. This was odd because the van didn't belong to any local delivery services, and the neighbors hadn't seen it before. It soon became clear that such vans could be rented anonymously from a company on the outskirts of Boston. Lewis sent an inquiry to the rental company and learned that the van was rented by a woman using a false name and fake address. Surveillance footage from a security camera in the company's parking lot showed a woman who looked like Susan. Her face was covered by a hood, but her gait and demeanor matched what police officers had seen on surveillance video outside their home. It was the first serious clue that could link Susan to Alex's disappearance. However, the biggest mystery remained: the money. The police checked Alex's bank account and found that a few weeks before his disappearance, about $775,000 in cash had been withdrawn from their joint account. Susan explained that Alex wanted to invest in a new project but did not provide specific documents or evidence of this version. When asked why she had not mentioned it earlier, the woman only shrugged her shoulders, saying that she had considered it irrelevant. Detective Lewis noticed her nervously rubbing the sleeves of her sweater as she gave this explanation and noted it as another detail in a long list of suspicious behavior. Meanwhile, in one of the landfills closest to the Pearson home, local workers found a large bag tied in a tight knot. The contents caused a wave of horror: bloody clothes that matched Alex's size and fragments of dark fabric that bore the marks of deep cuts. DNA samples confirmed the blood was Alex Pearson's, but no body was ever found. Rumors began to swirl around the discovery. Susan pretended to be terribly concerned, but her speeches to the press seemed too coherent, as if she had rehearsed her words in advance. The police analyzed her finances and found that, shortly before her husband disappeared, she had made several transfers to an offshore bank account registered in the Virgin Islands. Why would an ordinary housewife, seemingly completely distant from the business world, need this secret account? Lewis began scouring her social media, trying to find anything that might reveal her connections or her behavior prior to Alex's disappearance. Susan's entries over the past year had barely mentioned her husband, although they had often posted photos of holidays and family trips together in the past. Instead, her accounts began to feature photos from expensive restaurants and luxurious landscapes, which she captioned with quotes about freedom and a new life. This suggested that Alex's disappearance might have been part of a pre-planned scheme. There were too many strange coincidences: the sudden improvement in her financial situation, the rental van, the chemical traces in the garage, and the appearance of a man who had once been a part of her life. Lewis managed to track down the very same offshore account. It turned out that Susan had transferred a substantial amount of money from it to another bank, where the money was used to pay a lawyer who specialized in divorce cases and divorce proceedings. This was strange because Susan had never stated any intention of divorcing Alex. She had told everyone that their marriage was strong, and her husband's disappearance was a real blow to her. The detectives realized they were dealing with a much more complicated scheme than they had realized. Susan didn't just want to get rid of her husband. She was acting on an elaborate plan that included both hiding evidence and trying to make her behavior fit the image of a grief-stricken wife. But her calmness at key moments gave way to Lewis's experienced eye, and he began to unravel this tangle of lies. In one of the interrogations, when Lewis began asking her questions about the van and the offshore transfers, Susan showed nerves for the first time. Her face turned pale, her hands began to tremble faintly, and her voice grew higher and sharper as she tried to accuse the detective of bias and bullying. But Lewis was adamant. He had already seen her true nature beneath the mask of dainty tears. The case, which began as a mysterious disappearance, gradually began to resemble a complex game of chess where each move Susan thought out in advance. But there were errors in her game, and Lewis was sure he could expose her before she made her next move. He knew now that the key lay in figuring out who the anonymous caller on her phone was and how they were connected to Alex's disappearance. However, he realized that Susan could have had an accomplice who knew how to leave no trace or perhaps even manipulated her. Still unable to find Alex's body but with enough circumstantial evidence in hand, the detectives began preparing for the next step. They waited, waiting for Susan to make her next move, hoping that her greed or confidence in her own integrity would cause her to make a mistake. But Lewis knew that if Susan kept to her line and didn't speak up, they would have to act on the edge to crush her carefully constructed facade, unraveling the disguise. In late December 2023, Boston was slowly preparing for the holidays, but the atmosphere in the Pearson household was darker than ever. The police still had no hard evidence against Susan Pearson, but Detective Lewis knew they were getting closer to a clue every day. He was under more pressure from the management, the public demanding answers, Alex's relatives harassing the department with constant calls. Meanwhile, Susan seemed to feel more and more confident in her role. She even started showing up at the station less often, preferring to spend her time out of town, ostensibly seeking support from friends and family. But Lewis knew that such confidence often precedes error, so he put her under unspoken surveillance. Her movements over the next few days were surprisingly predictable. Shopping, visits to friends, a few trips to the lawyer. It all seemed harmless enough. But on the fourth day of surveillance, something changed. Susan, who usually drove her white SUV, suddenly moved into a rented gray sedan. Lewis watched her movements closely. The car pulled onto a suburban highway and headed toward a deserted area north of Boston, where there was a lonely warehouse. Long abandoned, only a few locals knew the place. It was an old hangar that had once been used to store equipment but now stood empty. When Susan pulled up in front of the warehouse and got out of the car, she looked around, checking to see if anyone was around, and then disappeared inside the building. Lewis knew this was their chance. He told his men to keep their distance so as not to scare her away and quietly walked around the warehouse, peering through the dirty windows. Susan was not alone. Inside with her was a tall man with a lean build that Lewis had not seen before. He took a few pictures on his phone, recording their encounter, and then signaled for detention. The police officers rushed inside, leaving Susan and her mysterious companion no chance of escape. As they searched, they found a rusty metal container with implements that looked like gardening tools, but all of them had been thoroughly cleaned of traces. At first glance, they were ordinary items, but Lewis knew there was nothing random about this story. The man was apprehended, and Susan was once again taken away for questioning. This time, she was not so calm. She tried desperately to explain the encounter with the stranger, claiming it was just a family friend who was helping her search for Alex. But Lewis wasn't buying her words. He watched her face lose color as police officers sounded out what they found in the container. Traces of fibers that matched the fabric found in the landfill with Alex's blood. The man apprehended at the warehouse appeared taciturn. He introduced himself as Jim Baker, said he just happened to be in the area, and had no idea what Susan was doing here. But Lewis and his team began to press him, showing him camera shots and phone records. They were finally able to decipher that Jim was the very man Susan had been talking to at night for months. He was her accomplice. This became clear to the detectives after the first interrogation. Now it remained to be seen how deep his role in Alex's disappearance went. Lewis decided to check out another lead. He remembered that Susan had mentioned going to the shores of Quabbin Lake to get her mind off her missing husband. It had seemed like an empty phrase at the time, but now the place might prove to be a clue. The police went to the lake shore with search dogs and underwater exploration equipment. If Susan had indeed disposed of Alex's body, it could be there. The search took several days. The lake was deep, with cold, almost black water, but on the third night, the searchers found a sack tied to a large rock lying on the bottom. Inside were remains. The body was in a badly decomposed state, but thanks to personal belongings and fragments of cloth, they were able to establish that it was indeed Alex Pearson. When Susan learned of the discovery, her face was devoid of all emotion. Her lawyer tried to fight to the last, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial and could have been planted. But the police already had enough: Jim's testimony, blood traces matching, financial transactions, videotapes, and now the body they'd found. All the evidence was adding up to a picture from which Susan tried to extricate herself, but to no avail. She was arrested right in the house where she once lived with Alex and their daughter. Now that place was an empty reminder of a life that ended the night Alex didn't come home. Susan didn't utter a word as she was led away, only looking gloomily at Lewis, who stood in the doorway. But for Lewis, the matter was not over. He knew that Susan was not the only brain behind this operation. There was the confidence of a man who counted on the flawless execution of the plan in her actions. But what if someone else was helping her? Someone who remained in the shadows and knew they would be looking for Alex's body specifically in the lake? The arrest of Susan Pearson and Jim Baker was the beginning of a high-profile trial that divided public opinion. The arrests and the abundant evidence gathered by Detective Lewis promised that Alex Pearson's case would be one of the most talked about in Boston's court chronicles. The charges against Susan included conspiracy to murder, money laundering, and organizing the concealment of a body. The trial began in mid-January 2024, and each session was closely watched by reporters and numerous spectators. The courtroom was filled with reporters watching every movement of the participants of the trial. Alex's relatives sat on the benches with hardened faces, avoiding looking at Susan. The attorneys for both sides began with statements that set the tone for the trial. The prosecution portrayed Susan as a cold-blooded killer, willing to do anything for money and freedom from family obligations. The first witness was Jim Baker. His face seemed haggard, and his voice shook as he testified against his former accomplice. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Jim agreed to tell the whole truth, confessing how he had helped Susan with cleaning up the tracks in the garage, transporting the body, and getting rid of the evidence. He detailed how Susan had manipulated him with promises of riches and a new life, but soon his tone changed. There was hatred in his voice, and as he spoke, it became clear to the court that it was Susan who was directing their actions. What followed was a demonstration of the evidence. The prosecution presented surveillance footage of Susan renting a van, as well as chemical traces in the garage, documents of her financial transactions, and forged passports hidden on the lakeshore. One by one, the details became more and more undeniable. Experts confirmed that there were indeed microscopic traces of Alex's blood on the tools found, and that the will found by the lake had been signed by Alex himself 2 months before his death. But the centerpiece was the unveiling of Alex's will and the financial schemes that Detective Lewis had uncovered. Susan tried to explain that her husband had handled the offshore accounts himself, that the money had been transferred for their mutual safety. But the prosecuting attorney, Jennifer Smith, insisted otherwise. She drew the line that Susan, upon learning of the will, had decided to eliminate her husband in order to gain access to all his assets and free herself from the bonds of marriage. Her motives, the prosecutor argued, were so simple they were frightening in their cruelty: greed and a desire to start a new life without Alex. Susan remained unfazed throughout the trial. In the courtroom, she appeared reserved and at times even seemed cold, which was interpreted by the prosecution as indifference to her husband's fate. Her lawyer tried to appeal to the fact that all charges were based on the testimony of a dubious accomplice and circumstantial evidence. But when Susan's father, William Harper, appeared in court, the case took an unexpected turn. Harper was subpoenaed to clarify his role in the case. He tried to play the role of a caring father, supporting his daughter in her time of need, but Lewis knew there was more behind that facade. When he began to be asked questions about finances and related transactions, he lost confidence. Pressured by new evidence that revealed his connection to offshore accounts and use of money, he began to muddle through his testimony. After much questioning, Harper was forced to admit that he knew of Susan's plans to gain control of Alex's fortune and that he had advised her on how to cover her tracks. His confession was a turning point in the trial. The prosecution charged Harper with complicity in conspiracy and financial fraud, and his attempts to exonerate himself only further drowned Susan. Judges and jurors began to see this as not just a family drama, but a complex web of intrigue in which Susan and her father were trying to pull off a scheme, leaving Jim merely the executor of the dirty work. Eventually, after weeks of trial, the jury retired for deliberations. Tension in the courtroom rose as everyone waited for the verdict. When the jury returned to the room, there was a sepulchral silence. Susan Pearson was found guilty of organizing the murder, financial fraud, and attempting to cover up the crime. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The judge said her actions showed cold calculation and total disregard for human life. Jim Baker was given a 15-year sentence for accessory after the fact, a mitigation for him given his willingness to cooperate with the investigation. William Harper, convicted as an accessory to financial fraud and concealing evidence of a crime, received 20 years in prison. His status as a respected public figure could no longer protect him from a just punishment. When Susan heard the verdict, she broke down for the first time. Her calm, almost indifferent expression gave way to rage and despair. She screamed at the judge, at the prosecution, accusing everyone around her of conspiring against her. But her words were drowned out by the incessant hum of the courtroom, where reporters were already rushing to tell their newsrooms about the end of the high-profile case.